Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Colleen O'Toole, who is an author, occupational therapist, and psychotherapist. Also joining us is Colleen's husband, David Duncan, who is a strategic planning consultant to social mission enterprises and a personal coach. Good morning, Colleen and David. It's wonderful to see you and to see you both in the relatively the same place at the same time. You're on different screens, but in the same place. So welcome. It's really nice to see you and to hear about pilgrimages and all the ways that you are engaging pilgrimage individually, but also together as a couple. So I thought I'd actually start by asking about pilgrimage artifacts. And I know that you've brought that there's a couple, and we're going to weave those into this conversation. And we'll start with David.
All right. Well, thank you. And it's so lovely to see you again, Heather, to talk to you again. And we've had a connection, I guess, for just a little while, but I'm really glad we have time together with you this morning. So my artifact is, it hangs off of this panuelo. And this is a bandana that those of us at the Canadian Company of Pilgrims are issued once we have been trained as hospitalleros or hospitalleras. And mine happens to have this little wooden arrow with the word Zabaldika on it. Do you happen to know what Zabaldika is, Heather? Do you know that one?
Don't. So please share.
Well, so I cherish this. It's a place. It's a place in the Basque Country. And it is a place that you can reach if you've walked way too far in the first 2 days on the Camino Frances. And it's a beautiful little Donativo albergue. So a hostel run in with a traditional Jacobean welcome. It's run and organized by the church in this case. So it's also known as a parochial. And there's a small group of nuns that essentially administer and run it. But there are always volunteers who staff the hostel, welcome the pilgrims day in, day out. And after this second very, very long day, and of course, being a church, you have to go up a hill to get to it. I get to this beautiful little Donativo albergue in Zabaldika. And the welcome that I received at that place remains the most genuine, warm welcome that I've received anywhere by anyone. I was profoundly moved, and I saw the man who was welcoming me wearing one of these Canadian flag bandanas, but he very clearly had a Southwest US accent. And I asked him about what this was all about. And he told me that he had been trained by the Canadian Company of Pilgrims. Yes, he's from New Mexico with him and his wife, but they happen to get trained up here in Canada, in Nova Scotia of all places. I mean, the other end of the continent, really. And he told me what the role of the hospitalero was. And essentially, it's receiving, tending, minding the pilgrims. And just as it was in the old days, giving them at the very least a warm welcome, a bed, food, and security for the night before they continue their pilgrimage. But what happened after that was that I was so moved by what they were doing, the gift that they were giving back. I had no idea who the Canadian Company of Pilgrims was at this point, but within 6 months, I'd been trained by a lovely trio of people, notably one named Ingrid Folkers, who I love dearly, and they taught me how to do the job. And so ever since, I've had that little wooden arrow on my panuelo to remind me of the importance of service, to remind me of a good way to receive pilgrims, and a good way to model that role when I'm on the Camino, but as an hospitalero rather than as a pilgrim.
love the Canadian flag on it. I mean, in my travels around it, Canadians are always easy to spot because of the flags on the backpacks, or there's just always indicators that a traveler is Canadian, maybe even wearing a backpack on the front versus the back. And so we could probably have a very interesting conversation about why that is and why Canadians love to differentiate themselves and self-identify as Canadians during travel. And I thought it's probably a good moment to hear about the Canadian Company of Pilgrims. The organization is the national mirror of the American pilgrims on the Camino, and yet there are some differences in the way that the organization is run and the types of support and events and chapters that exist. So if we could hear a bit about that, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Uh, well, I can go first, and Colleen has some complimentary remarks on that perhaps. But as you say, it's the national organization, and just as there are national organizations and even regional organizations that support the Camino, the pilgrimage, networking, and information sharing, ours is the Canadian one for that part of Canada other than Quebec, but we work in yet ever more close partnership with our friends just across the river that we are right beside, called the Association de Québec à Compostelle. And we've got a really strengthened connection with them recently. We've got two wonderful local liaisons with the people in Quebec, because of course in Quebec the predominant language is French. And so we're supporting principally the mostly English-speaking part of Canada. Um, we are a federated sort of an organization, which means that we have, well, 3 weeks ago I would have said 18 chapters, but I've just managed to add to the list, and we are up to 20. We have just added 2 new chapters. This is hot off the press, brand new news. It's very exciting. We haven't added chapters in a little while, and we will have 2 new chapters up in the north of Ontario in Thunder Bay, right on the top of Lake Superior, and in a beautiful community called Peterborough, which is it's a little ways from where we are. It's a little ways from Kingston. It's a little ways from Toronto, and so they're a good-sized city, and it made sense for them to have a place because there's some pilgrims there that would really love to connect and have activities. So what are those kinds of activities? Typically, chapters are organizing walks, coffee gatherings. Sometimes we meet at, in our case, we meet in Hamilton, Ontario. We'll sometimes meet at the Irish pub on a Tuesday and listen to some music from one of our pilgrim friends, Stephen Haller, who's a fiddler, but he's a wonderful pilgrim. He's actually a philosopher of the and studies the pilgrimage. I mean, what a great gig! You know, you get paid to study pilgrimage. It's fantastic. So so those are some of the things that we do. We have had a wonderful connection recently in Vancouver and in Victoria, BC, British Columbia, where we gathered with not only other Canadians and our friends from Quebec, but our friends from the American Pilgrims on the Camino. And in fact, Colleen and I are members of both. We're members of the American group as well. But we had this amazing gathering in Vancouver, all of us, and we were sharing all the different kinds of things that we do. And so there's a lot of similarities of the things that we do. Um, the Americans have a really rich national program of information sessions, like podcasts and things. We haven't started that yet, but we were inspired by what they're doing, and we may pick that up in Canada. And similarly, the Quebecois group does some things that are similar to what Colleen and I do when it comes to providing more involved sessions for returning pilgrims. And I know you're going to love this, because we cite your work all the time about integrating that experience of pilgrimage into our lives. And so there's a group in Quebec that does some of that. We had a great conversation en français about what that is, and so we're sharing ideas with Quebec on that front too. So there's not only the standard things, but there's this evolution of new things that we're all doing, and now we're sharing so much more. Thank you, Zoom. The only good thing that came out of COVID was the fact that we were in each other's living rooms, doing what we're doing right now.
So I just wanted to add one of the things. Hi, it's Colleen, by the way, because I haven't spoken yet. It's just the way that happened to start. One of the things that was great from Quebec was talking about the small group integration. So David and I had started on our own, just 8 to 9 pilgrims returning. So it's more of an intimate experience at someone's home instead of in a coffee shop. And they've got a more elaborate thing worked out, I think. So we're talking with each other and sharing those ideas. So that's kind of brand new, just starting to work on that. But I think it has been important to talk to our pilgrims about the difference between that reentry phase and integration, because people get confused about that. They think they're integrating things when they're just actually landing and talking about what happened to them, right? So, and there's a place for that there for sure. I mean, it's one of the steps toward it. So that's been helpful. And what else do we do? I think outreach is what I think is the most important thing that we're doing, and we haven't quite figured out how to do that. We could do it better, because I know we're when we walk on the Camino, we meet Canadians and Americans as well that they don't know about these local organizations, and they're free. It's a community offered, lots of experience. When I started, before I went on my first Camino, I went to several of these meetings because I was terrified, and I feel bad that I was nervous, but I was. I needed to see that people would go and then come back and go and come back, all ages, all abilities. And there's a real benefit to that. I think that's one of the biggest benefits of both of our organizations. I hope that we can find a way to reach more people.
I think that it probably would have been helpful 13 minutes ago for me to also introduce into the introduction of this the fact, Colleen, that you are an occupational therapist and psychotherapist, and so you have a way of seeing pilgrimage that is both as a pilgrim yourself, but also you're seeing the psychological aspects and the therapeutic aspects and the healing aspects of pilgrimages. And so I want to keep that in mind as we progress through the conversation, because you do add a level of professional expertise to this work that is well aligned with my own. And so there's a lot of similarities in the perspectives about how we see pilgrimages. And I'm curious to hear about both of your experiences with the first pilgrimage and how you have integrated. You are attuned to this idea of, and this process of integration as being something deeper and more prolonged than returning from a pilgrimage and talking about the pilgrimage. That is often one step along the way to integration. And so I'd love to hear from both of you about your pilgrimage experiences, starting with the beginning, the first pilgrimage experience. And I suspect that there's now these experiences intertwined together, and it's hard to tease apart which which processes were happening at what point. And so, yeah, either of you or both of you, you riff off of each other. So I'd love to hear, like, if we can just kind of orient now around the actual pilgrimage experiences as a pilgrim, but then also I know, Colleen, you're going to have thoughts as a psychotherapist as well.
Do you want me to go first, David?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yep.
the whole riffing thing, as we mentioned, Heather, sometimes leads to, we get very excited and we talking over each other because we're excited to get to the next sentence. So sometimes we need to be reeled back in. So my first Camino was in 2019, and it's interesting that you say that I'm walking with the lens of a therapist, occupational therapist. And I think of myself as an occupational therapist, although I've trained in psychotherapy, I do psychotherapy. My lens, I think, is occupational therapy. But when I was walking as a trauma survivor. Like I was walking to heal. So it was probably 3/4 of the way into that pilgrimage when I realized what was happening, when I was kind of putting it together. And I thought, oh my gosh, pilgrimage is a treatment for trauma. And I know that other people have already thought about this because I was new to the pilgrimage at that point, and the veterans group have been doing this, and this has been happening. But I had a different kind of trauma. This was relational trauma. It was, we can get into that later, but it was so the Camino for me was really, it was a life-saving thing. It wasn't an adventure. It wasn't, it was like a trip to the emergency room. And I don't want to give too much away because in the book I'm talking about what happens at the end, but the level of my ignorance about what the Camino is actually about on, the traditional, faith-based aspects, all that's not what I was there for. I was there to walk back into my body, and it was just um, an instinctive motivation that I needed to walk. This was before really understanding how that worked, and so at some point, I think in the book, I talk about this feeling of remembering myself. And I meant really like arms and legs and remembering myself, like that, that comes bit by bit over the Camino, if that's what you're there for, if you're there um, for that purpose. But it was 3/4 through when the idea for a semi-supported Camino came to me, that idea of Let's Walk Home, that I started the pilot project. Because I know from talking to other people that said, oh, you're so brave to walk on your own. And I know lots of people do that, but there are some people that are nervous to do that. And for me, it was not being brave. It was being desperate. I needed to go. I knew that I needed um, to do this. And so I just pushed myself to the starting line, and just started. But I thought, there's a lot of people that never actually get there. And if you could give people just the right amount of support, and then you just let the Camino or the pilgrimage do its thing. I'm not doing anything, while the people are there. It's the pilgrimage is doing it. I'm just building up people to get to the starting point. But that whole idea was born 3/4 through my pilgrimage. I kind of walked into understanding it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I think the way that you're describing this, that this was an act of desperation initially for you, and then you felt that the pilgrimage itself was the thing. And I think from a psychological standpoint, and certainly from a therapy standpoint, we often think that our work is in the room with someone, and to an extent it is, but we're very afraid to release control over to something external, because maybe it decenters the therapist. And so I love what you're saying about this, that the work actually happens within the pilgrimage, and the role of the therapist may be something completely different, which we can talk about in a little while.
So my first pilgrimage was 10 years ago this year, and it came about as a result of some realigning of stars, and coming to the end of a life chapter. And fast, going back many years to my mid-20s, I think I read a book that referred to the pilgrimage to Santiago, and it was an Umberto Eco book. And if you've read any of his books, it was either The Name of the Rose or it was Foucault's Pendulum. I think it was the former. And I want to reread it and see that I'm probably right, that there would have been a reference to the pilgrimage to Santiago. At that point, I was looking at it through the romantic eyes of a 20-something and thinking, Darby Templars, and there's a pilgrimage that people have been walking for hundreds of years and they're still doing it. And I just parked the idea and I said, I'm going to do that someday. And it wasn't until those stars aligned and that life chapter was drawing to an end that the idea resurfaced, that I hadn't thought of it for 30 odd years, I guess. So I decided to walk on short notice, and all I knew was that I would start here, Saint Jean in this case. I would end here, Santiago, and something amazing would happen in between. And that was the extent of my preparation. I didn't plan it. I didn't train. I just started walking. So similar, actually, in some ways to Colleen. Just propelled myself, but for different reasons. And so that's how I undertook it. And what I took away from it was, originally I called it reconnecting with my authentic self, and we've heard that expression so much that I almost hate saying it these days because it sounds hackneyed, but it's so important. And so that's the way I describe it: reconnected with my authentic self. Now, when I returned, I happened to have like Colleen, there was instinct driving some of this. I kind of knew intuitively that I should connect with 5 people on return, 5 specific people who knew me from different angles, to share what had happened. And one of the things was, in fact, that my intuitive self got refortified. It had been dampened for decades by, the fact-based, rational mind. So my intuitive nature that I had relied upon earlier in life resurfaced and got in balance with that other side. So that was something very noticeable and tangible. But when I came back to talk to the 5 people, there was one who is a Métis elder. So within the traditions of indigenous peoples here in Turtle Island, aka North America, the Métis are one of the 3 groups we recognize, broad groups that we recognize in Canada, and they exist in the States, but I don't think they're called that. And this Métis elder had become a friend. He's somebody I'd worked with, and he'd become a friend. And I told him I thought that I had reconnected with my authentic self, and he said, "No, you re-embraced it. It was always there. You just re-embraced it." And that, to me, was the most important insight. And subsequently, I've asked friends that have known me since childhood what they saw in me, and they saw David returning, which is interesting. That's their way of expressing, I think, the same thing. And so that's the great value of pilgrimage to me initially. And there have been nuanced lessons ever since on subsequent pilgrimages. But that one for sure was the best thing, because it changed the arc of my life at that point. And I'm on such a good path. And now I'm sharing that path with Colleen. And if it weren't for a particularly poignant moment on that first Camino, so happens to have been on the 9th day of the 9th month, and there's a whole weird story about that, which we might actually touch on at some point later in this conversation, given what Colleen will probably say about artifacts later that we brought home from pilgrimage. If it weren't for that moment, I wouldn't be sitting here with Colleen as my wife. It wasn't a direct line at all, but that moment was a contributor to my ability to be here with her.
Can I say something? That just, I love that. The idea of it not being a straight line, but also there was so much of this that it just felt like, we didn't ask for any of this. We just went to the Camino to, instinctively to heal something. And then, just getting out of the way and seeing clearly, all these gifts just kind of fell out of it. They felt like Camino gifts, I would say. The us meeting each other, and actually, because we met before we'd done Caminos, but we didn't really see each other. And in fact, our first meeting, I have to describe the first meeting.
Boy,
David describes this. How did you guys meet? Because people thought we met on the Camino. And David said, no, Colleen kept coming to these, Camino 101s because I was so nervous, right? So the first time I was
let's
in the
face it,
Camino
you're a hot
101,
mess.
I was a hot mess. Yeah. So I was, you're in this room full of people. A lot of them are returned pilgrims. They're all talking to each other. And he said he looked across the room, and there I was standing there, and it was like there was a light over me. And everybody says, oh, that's so sweet. There was a light. He said, no, she was so strange. She was all by herself and like with this light over me. But people think it was something different, but it was, of course, it was the isolation of trauma. It was pre-Camino. And it was like a force field around me. And David was this gregarious, showing people his backpack and all his stuff in it. And I just thought, this man is very strange. All the oversharing and everything else. And, so our initial meeting was actually, not repulsion is too strong, but there was a weird, we were looking for each other because we thought we were that strange that we kept actually looking for the other strange person. And then it was probably a year and a half after I came back from my Camino, not a different person, but like when you say, you re-embraced yourself, and I say I remembered myself, it is just, it's just like meeting yourself. Like you have become shrouded to yourself and other people too. And so um, now after pilgrimage, the shroud comes off, you, you're visible to yourself and to others. But I really like the way you say that. And I think people talk about that. But it's different than, people that might not have gone will say, oh, you changed, you're a new person, or you're actually more of yourself because you've gotten rid of all the stuff that wasn't you. And now, the essence is more clear. But I like that.
I've been thinking a lot this week. I'm preparing to go to France to participate in a ceremony related to a church that I have been researching, and it's a World War I memorial. And I've been thinking about the idea of pilgrimage amidst battlefields and amidst places of war and death. And I think that pilgrimages are often about that. There is a side, whether that is a dead saint or there's some type of death within the self, but the pilgrimage itself is really about life, and it's about rediscovery. And I was jotting down some of the words that both of you were using as you described this initial pilgrimage, and the words were return, recalibrate, remember, restore. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about that in your experience. It does not sound to me like for either of you, it was an act of first discovery, that this was an act of rediscovery or return to, David, you said something authentic, your authentic self, which may be cliche, and yet pilgrims always talk about this.
Yeah.
So the cliche is a cliche for, I think, for a reason here. What is this? What is the phenomenon that is that there was some type of original joy? And we'll talk more in a second about Colleen's book because it's about restoring joy. So what is what is that? What is the going back or the return?
I was thinking something as we were talking about that, what happens when one is on the Camino de Santiago, that particular pilgrimage. And to answer your question really quickly, specifically, it's reflection. the reflection that you get from the people that you're walking with. They see you unfiltered, unlabeled, level with everybody. And there's that notion of communitas, which we can maybe define and talk about. But at its essence, I think the answer is you see yourself reflected through these total strangers you don't have prior relationship with. And so they don't have any stake, they don't have any axe to grind, they have no prejudging of you. They just see you in your whatever state you're in. And the state that we're in often can be that we've just gotten off our hamster wheel and we started walking. So we're just, we're not all bothered about meetings and labels and job titles and roles, relationships. We're just another human. So I think that's the short answer. But then the thing that I was sort of alluding to a second ago is, as I think it was when Colleen was talking about what happens on Camino. We sometimes, all of us, many of us, talk about there's something that the Camino gives us, that the pilgrimage gives us, and I instantly now think of words from Rebecca Scott, our friend, who was also at the Vancouver gathering and delivered a wonderful address. And part of her message was, it isn't the Camino that's doing anything. It's that walking in community. And I learned this from Colleen. It's that walking in community, that leveling of all of us as just humans from different walks, seeing each other really simply and reacting naturally with each other. And there's a lot of reflection going on between each other. And I think I probably saw that side of myself that I had forgotten because I was in relationships that required me to navigate and modify how I operated, which we all do in relationship, but so much so that I kind of lost parts of myself. I think that's how I'd stab at it, but that's a whole big can of worms that just opened up, I think. So
Yeah,
does that answer the question? Like, does that get at it a little bit?
and I would also say that what you're saying, I feel very strong. It's being seen, to not to oversimplify things, but when you say you're reflected in somebody else, there's so people learn over time on the pilgrimage, at least on my experience of them. We learn to see each other, and we stop and we listen to each other, and it can be quite different than what's happening at home. And it can be quite shocking to be seen actually when you've not been seen for a long time, because there's oh, that's me, they're seeing me. And then there's a whole, what is me thing happening. I remember, walking up to Bercianos, which was the experience that, when I knew I would become a hospitalero, after this experience, there was this Spanish man, greeting me at the door. I'm walking, it's the end of a long day. And he's waving at me, saying in Spanish that we've been waiting for you. And I'm turn around and I look for somebody, and there's nobody there, and he's talking to me. I'm like, how does he? Why are you wait there? How can they be waiting for me? Like, you don't call donativos. There's no reservation. You just walk up. And the way that man greeted me, it was like it was sacred. These moments are really sacred that happen between people, and it's, in therapy, there's often so much work, we have to do work. We're working at it. We're doing all this work. But in pilgrimage, it's more like letting go and stepping into it. And it's a lot quicker. You have to do work to get there, but it's just so, the moment I had in the mountains was being seen by the divine, whatever that is. But I'm not, I don't have God language. It'd be difficult to kind of articulate what I think that was, to give language to it, but it really was a being seen. And that was the first step in restoring everything. But that was what you said is true. I think that's the essence of it. Maybe, but do you have more, Heather? What do you mean? What do you think?
Well, I've really been thinking a lot about this. It's becoming more and more of a theme in my work rather than sort of setting aside this idea that the transformation or healing or integration pieces, that there is this revisiting, a return, a repair. And so I'm really curious about, and I think both of you have articulated it. Colleen, you're saying being seen, the reflected, so people being a mirror, reflected, they're reflecting us, but they're also reflecting the deepest parts of being human. So it's not necessarily a selfish reflection, sort of this a narcissistic reflection of the self. It's actually a reflection of our deepest humanity back to us, whether that is through hospitality or acts of welcoming home. I mean, this idea of being welcomed home, even though it's not necessarily your actual home, I think is really important. And I think it does tap into something from childhood almost that we want, maybe we don't even know we need. And so yeah, it's really become a big curiosity for me. This the re part of this, which is sort of this coming back. And I'd love to hear actually more from you, Colleen, about why you wrote a book called Restoring Joy. And the whole title of the book is Restoring Joy, 40 Days and 40 Nights on the Camino de Santiago. You address at the beginning of the book, or near the beginning of the book, the idea of seeking out an opportunity, seeking out the pilgrimage, and being a pilgrim because of ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief, which are big terms and even bigger experiences. And I'd like to start the conversation about your book with those terms and to define them and kind of orient listeners and viewers to what that is, and then why in the world you went from Canada to France to start the Camino Frances because of ambiguous loss.
Right. So before we start that, but actually probably directly connected to it, when you were talking about being seen and being reflected, not just being in an individual, but humanity being that whole brother and sister thing that communitas is, being brought back into the fold is part of what is sacred and healing on the Camino, when we see it happen all the time. And certainly the traditional welcome, that's what it's all about. It's about scooping people up at the door. I've made a place for you to, as a person who sort of describes yourself as a Buddhist atheist, but, I use a lot of biblical references, strangely, including 40 days, 40 nights, which is not lost on me. There's this something from the Bible about, I've made a place for you, come and I've made a place for you, the importance of making a place for people because they've seen that they're important. You are just you as you are, your messy, dusty self, falling all over the place. You're important. I've made a place for you. And that's part of the healing. So I think when you're talking about the book and the idea of me going on Camino because of that, I did not put those two things together before I went because I couldn't. I'd never been there. All I knew was that I needed to walk. I needed to pare down all my things into a backpack and walk into the world, walk out of my life and into the world. And I had some sense that by walking out of my life, I would walk back into it, but I didn't really know how that was going to happen. And I also knew that I was not an intrepid traveler, so I needed to have something set up for me, right? So I was not going to be going backpacking ever, into the woods. So when I remembered for our friend Stephen, who talked about the pilgrimage, um, through Oliver Shore, the music is how I registered it. When I needed that, it came back to me. It sort of floated back to me. I'll go do this walk. But when you're asking, so that was how I got there. I wasn't putting ambiguous loss together with this is going to help me, but in retrospect, I would say it's a cure for what happened, because in ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief, at least my kind, parental alienation, which we can talk about, which I don't love the word, because the child is also alienated. I've lost a child, and the child has lost a mother and a whole half a family. But this kind of loss, and when I talk about grief in the book, there's, grief is not pathological. Grief is something that is part of us. It goes hand in hand with joy, and they all work together. But the usual way we process grief, when someone dies, something happens like that, there's a clear loss, a clear end. It goes however, people are talking about it now. It used to be linear. Now we talk about it goes in circles. It goes, there's patterns that happen. It gets a little bit easier, a little bit lighter as time goes on. But it's always part of you. It's woven into you. But with ambiguous loss, and I'll just talk about my own, but there's lots of kinds. There's, you lose somebody to dementia. The person is still there, but they're not really there. You're still missing the essence of the person that you remember. With alienation, or we'll call it estrangement, the person is still alive, but you're grieving your relationship. And there's always the hope that you can say the right thing, do the right thing, wait for the right moment, and make it better. And so then the loss is not there. There's a possibility that you can fix it. So you remain stuck in this pattern of loss, and you're not really alive. You're half one foot's half in the other life, one foot's in this life. And the nature of that for estrangement, it really is a casting out. It's ostracism. It's being tossed out of community, which again is biblical. It was a biblical punishment. To be ostracized is to excommunicate, throw out of community. And it was the worst punishment you can have. It's heartbreaking. And so when you imagine that kind of wound, and then go on the Camino, where you're so shocked first that somebody sees you, that somebody, that you're being welcomed. It's the opposite. It's that re-embracing. And I'm not sure anything else would do that. I'm just, in that way. So, when I set out to walk, I did not know what would happen. I just knew that I needed to do something, because this had been 4 years of this. And, I was just feeling like I didn't have much left in me. I couldn't find a reason to keep going. And, that was getting a little scary. But, if you're familiar with IFS, and I'm sure, that we are naturally multiple. And there's parts of us, there's manager parts and firefighter parts, without getting too much into it. There was a part of me that was like, no, there's got to be a way. There must be more, there must be a way. And that part is the part that took me on the Camino. But I was putting this together bit by bit. This was not me making a plan. This is going to help me. And I think your question was, why did I write the book? Were you asking me why I wrote the book as well?
I was asking, and I want to just summarize, to bring to the fore that one of the primary theme that you are addressing in the book has to do with the disintegration of the relationship with your daughter. And that is one example of ambiguous loss, and probably one of the biggest examples, because of the relationship starts at the very beginning, right, for another person, and then through life events, which you may or may not want to talk about here, the relationship then disintegrates, and while the person is still alive, your relationship isn't, and that connection is not. I also want to highlight the fact that the Camino has a long history of being a pathway for exile. That even from the perspective of one who was maybe committed a criminal act would be exiled onto the Camino, and then once the return, I mean, this could last for years. Once the person then returned to their home community, were welcomed back, which doesn't necessarily happen now. The welcoming back is often into the arms of other pilgrims or a community of pilgrims, and so there's a little bit different context for that, but the idea of exile and return has been something that has characterized the Camino for hundreds of years. And so it is appropriate then that you would have this sense of exile and find yourself on the Camino.
That makes sense. That feels true. I bet I see David smiling. I think it might.
Well, I was just thinking
something
just
there too.
A little story, but there is a bit of that still happening, and Belgium in particular, and I think to some extent in Germany, there are still programs, and I've forgotten the names of them, but I was delighted to meet a young man who was who'd run afoul of the law, and it was either back to juvie, or else he goes on the Camino accompanied by somebody who would be his sponsor, and I had the delight to meet this young Belgian fellow who'd walked out of his front door in traditional way, at the orders of a judge, with a family member, and he was on his 100th day at that point. And so he had a big celebration in community with a whole bunch of strangers, some of whom I'm very closely connected with and attached to this day. But yeah, that still happens, and he it wasn't exile per se, but it was, in a sense, it would have been exile, I suppose, from civil society where he lived, in order to grow, become a young man, and return with insight and maturity and renewed compassion for self and others. And he's on a good path now. So it worked. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. They keep doing it.
Yeah, it's the perfect treatment for that, actually. But what you said is you in the past, it was the whole deal. You get the whole meal deal. You do the walk and then you get back and then you're part of community again. I had to walk, and we all walk now. That's no guarantee, right? We're walking. We, I guess all we can hope for is that we're not exiled from ourselves anymore. And then what we return to people who can see us, who are able to see us, and that might not be the people that we hoped might be able to do that, because we, as we can't change anybody else, and we can't, people come around as they will, and they're able to, people are only capable of what they're capable of in the time. And when you asked, I'll just say a tiny bit about the estrangement, because I'm sure, but part of delivering this book into the world, which I think of as my book baby, it's another way to have a baby, is the amount of people, and I would say 50% of people, when I actually stop, when I say, people say, what is your book about when you're doing a book signing? And I sometimes, I'm getting better at this, but I'll do a bit of a thin, it's about walking out of grief into joy, and, just kind of make it palatable for everybody. But then when people stay long enough, and I'd say, well, the grief was about estrangement and alienation, I would say 50% of the people that I'm talking to have a look of recognition on their face, whether it's happened to them or somebody they know. So, I think it's really important that we bring it into the light, because people, as you say, it's taboo. Who are you if your child doesn't want to be with you. It's a huge rejection. But there's so ours was born out of divorce, and a complicated divorce, which I won't talk about too much. And of course, to get the best healthy outcome for the child, the divorcing parents are meant to work together to put the child first, to not fight over and all that whatnot. But not everybody's capable of that. And so what happens to the kids in the middle when they're young is they are just trying to cope. They do the best they can. And if they're forced to pick a side, sometimes they do. And I don't think it's unusual that this happens. It happens in different degrees. And at some point in the book, when I say, it's never the child's fault, and the friends that we're staying with here in Ottawa said, well, isn't it sometimes, when does the child become responsible for, when is it, when do they become responsible? But when this damage is done so young in children, the work that they have to do to look backwards into their life and see what's actually gone on, I think a lot of people just don't do it. They can't. It's too painful. So it's very different when this starts in childhood. It's insidious. You said disintegration. When I look back now, I can see what was happening. But in the moment, I think that's not possible. You don't think these things are possible. So you say, I'm overreacting, I just, and you let things slide. And by the time, it's taken hold, it's too late. There's so much confusion, I think, that's happening for the kids. They're just trying to cope. And so you stick around and you send letters and you keep the door open. But all that's it's really hard work. And, there's not a lot written from people who have gone through it. And, because there's even, there aren't a lot of fairy tale endings. It's hard. And so people aren't writing stories. They're not, what I was finding back in 2016 when I was understanding what was happening was people that were litigious, and self-help books that were not helpful. So none of it was very good. So my attempt in putting this out was, so that people know they're not alone, that it is possible, in whatever outcome, to walk back into your life and to step into joy and to make a life for yourself. That it's hard, but it's a doable thing. So, yeah.
And you've got a unique background to be able to write such a book. You, I have learned, that as a writer, you've got a unique voice, which I find enjoyable. And parenthetically, I just want to say I've read the book, but with editor hat on, or marketer guy hat on, or promoter guy. But I'm looking forward to just sitting in my rocking chair and reading it, unfettered, and just go on that journey again and just absorb it. But you've got a unique voice. You have a professional background that allows you to look at things in a particular way. You're a pilgrim, and you're also someone who's lived this experience. And in the background, Max the cat is coming to visit, and may hear him in the background, but he's really interested in all of this conversation too. And he just gave me a big thumbs up for saying that.
A big paw up.
Yeah, right.
Colleen, I'm actually thinking about, while you're talking, I'm thinking about what you said earlier around being seen on the Camino and what that feels like and how that is experienced. And I'm taking a leap here, or making a connection with you writing this book and releasing this book. There must be some parallel processes in terms of being seen, in terms of being very exposed and vulnerable and at the mercy of others. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's uncomfortable. It's a totally different thing. So we're staying with friends here in Ottawa, and they asked this great question last night as we were talking about the book. And Michael said, "Did you write it for you, or did you write it for your daughter?" I had to stop and think about it. And I think I wrote it for me. It was never intended to be a book. Like it was a blog. There's a whole nother manuscript, a writing project that is underneath this book, like a iceberg that already exists in full form. So a writing coach said, you should write a blog to, get your voice out there, that sort of thing. And I did that. And then the pandemic happened in 2020, and it became my pandemic project on Cape Cod, kind of piecing this thing together. And I thought, oh, this is a book. So, I was writing it for me as processing, because as you know, if you've written anything, the writing is cathartic. It's good, but editing is not. It's because you go over and over and rip the scab off over and over the thing, especially if you're writing about something difficult. But the first writing of it was for me, but releasing it, I think, was for my daughter, was to say, because I have silenced my voice for years, maybe up to a decade, for her, thinking it was helpful. And it actually didn't help anybody. And I can see after all this time has gone, gosh, to go backwards in time. Time is one of the themes in the book, to be able to go backwards, to do something differently. I would do things so differently. But I thought silence and being careful was going to help, because she was getting so much pressure in another place. And the more that I knew silence never helped me, not at all. I did it for her. But then when she was finally able to hear a little bit, at least understand very, like a little bit, I thought, this is the time, so I seized the time, because anybody that's been through this knows there's windows, the window goes up, you can have a conversation, something happens, the window goes down, and you just have to maximize that as much as possible. So the window was up, and it was almost ready to go. And I thought, I'm going to let it go. And David can tell you from sitting right there in the front row seat, how difficult it was to let it go. Even the woman who did the painting said, on the front cover, Debbie Finn, we were talking about this, and she said, you need to take this painting away from me, because I'm going to keep fiddling with it. I'm going to keep trying to make it better. People don't want to release things because how will it be received? Is it finished? Have I said it in the right way? I didn't feel, I'm basically talking about my own grief. So there's not, it's vulnerable, sure, but I'm not the first person that talked about grief. But yes, a couple of the first readers said, how do you feel? Like, is that not really vulnerable? And I was like, yes, like it's scary. It's a totally different thing to let it go, to say, here it is. This is my story. This is as good as it gets. And, yeah, it's so then to be met with, spontaneous, generous, feedback, that was unexpected. But it's another little step in the journey of reclaiming voice, I think, which is important, not just for me, but for people on the other side of that. So, yeah, scary.
Scary, and we live so much of our lives in a sense of conformity, or a sense of acquiescing, or bending around to fit boxes, whether that is relationship boxes or employment boxes, or spiritual boxes. And we often hear the idea of your tribe will find you, but the process to getting there is very challenging. And so in both releasing the book and in sharing your story and in sharing parts of you that were hidden, um, it is a bit like this liminal space until the tribe finds you, because they will find you. The community of people who have encountered some type of similar life experiences, will find you. But that's a very it does mirror the pilgrimage in the sense that it's a chosen liminality, that you've departed from what is familiar and you've departed from what is hidden, but you've not yet been seen fully. And so I can certainly appreciate the work that you have done internally, but also how difficult it is to release this creative output.
It's a couple of, I think in the very beginning, I said to a couple of people, and David, you remember this, it feels like sticking your foot into the road and being pretty sure somebody's going to run it over, but doing it anyway. It's a little, that's the feeling. I hadn't thought about it in that terms, but we talked, David, before about the book itself being a pilgrimage. But I hadn't thought about the liminal space, and it sure is. It's exactly, it's just like in the beginning of my first pilgrimage, thinking that there were going to be all these people leaving Saint Jean. I had no interest in walking into the mountains by myself. And there was nobody, because I waited for the singing mass in the Basque church. And, it was 9:00. Everybody was gone. And I was on the bridge going back and forth. It took me 10 minutes to leave the town. But once you're out and you start to breathe again, you're in the new space. But those jumping off points, they can be, they deter people, right? Of course they do, because who wants to stick their foot in the road, right? So, yeah. I certainly, after releasing it, I look at authors in a new way. I look at people releasing books in a new way, people releasing art, because it's a totally different thing. And Brené Brown has this whole thing about being in the arena. But it's a totally different thing to not just make it, but release it. It's something else altogether. So I have a deep appreciation for all us imperfect people,
It is really difficult to release some. I think creative projects get back to the heart of what makes us human, and that is it's a very vulnerable act to release, to create something that is creative, but also, as you say, to release it. I want to ask both of you about, you've individually talked about the Camino, your first Camino, and maybe subsequent Caminos coming at a time of transition, of life transition, relational transition, relationships ending, grief, starting something new, seeing relationships maybe in a new way, returning to the self, questing for something, maybe not even realizing what that is, but that in itself is a transition. And it seems like both of you have taken your own pilgrimage experiences and your life experiences, and you're doing something that is it's of significant value for others, because you've taken these moments of life and then pilgrimage experiences and your awareness of humans and people you may have worked with, in occupational therapy or in psychotherapy, and those experiences, and you are now wanting to give to other people in a way that helps others integrate these pilgrimage experiences, but pilgrimage is a vehicle for the integration of the life experience. So there's like a double process. There's the integration of the life experiences and transitions vis-a-vis the pilgrimage. And I really want to hear what you're doing with this, and doing together, because you are flourishing together in this area. And I want to hear more about that.
So one thing that I immediately think of is our time as hospitalleros. So the people that manage the hostels, we do it for 2-week stints, and we're trained to do it, as I mentioned earlier. But the what happens? Well, it just so happens that when Colleen and I were doing it together as a couple with quite different professional experiences, as well as obviously just being different people, but we used our professional backgrounds in a particular way uh, to enrich what we were offering pilgrims as they walked in the door. So, as I had said earlier, the traditional Jacobean welcome, the Jacobean, of course, referencing St. James, and person that historically was the relics in Santiago that the pilgrims were going to see. So that's where that word comes from for those viewers and listeners that aren't familiar. That traditional welcome is something that we thought very carefully about because of how we had been received when we were as pilgrims. I talked about that incredible welcome at Zabaldika, and it inspired me to act as an hospitalero in a particular way, to think about certain things that I would do and say, and do them in a particular way. So, but the thing is that Colleen and I were doing things together. We were we were um, creating a temporary home for whomever walked in the door. And you touched on this earlier, Heather. That's exactly how we see it. We were literally saying, as part of the welcome, that this is your home for the next few hours. And we created an experience that allowed people to first to settle and get the mechanics sorted out. Where's my bed? Where do I put my stuff? What time's dinner? What time's bedtime? When we have to leave in the morning? We had all that sorted out, but we were also creating time for people to connect and to and reflective time together by themselves as well, in particular ways. And Colleen has this great expression, which she might touch on, is landing in layers. And so people walk in the door, they're dusty cells, as you said, Colleen. They're dusty, sweaty cells, and they just need to get the shower sorted out and dump their gear and whatnot. But then gradually they're settling in a variety of different ways. And so we were conscious of that process would always happen because we've been there, done that, and we felt we needed to create together the way that might happen. And so there were a lot of little things that we did to make it happen. There's a tradition at the Bercianos albergue, which is an after dinner optional oración, an oration, literally. But we created essentially a sharing circle, and that was just informed by the way we look at spirituality and faith. But we made space for anybody to be there if they wanted to share what was going on at that moment on their Camino in their own language. And the geographic reality of that particular albergue is that it's about halfway through the Camino Frances if you're going from San Jean Pied de Port to Santiago. So they've been walking for 2 weeks, and inevitably stuff's going on, even if they didn't intend. And so what we were making space for together was for people to share. And it was sometimes only by communicating through their eyes, because we didn't understand their language, that something had moved them. And we that was just one little example. The other one, I suppose, would be the way we thanked the pilgrims that had gone before, and gave the pilgrims that were with us an opportunity to give to the pilgrims who would follow after in some tangible way, at their option. You know, maybe it's a contribution, or a responsible contribution, to help keep the lights on, buy tomorrow's food, or maybe it was a contribution in the form of helping clean up or sweep or cook. So what was essentially happening, what we were doing, was we were creating a temporary community, and in so doing, what happened as well is that individuals were having healing experiences, that because they were being seen sometimes. And there's a great example of this that Colleen talks about, one of the very last people that we saw, and it was sort of the last moments, when some significant healing was done, because she was allowed to land in layers and be with community, and given her time to decide whether she wanted to share something. But something happened for her that was really important. So we do that together because I'm kind of a coachy kind of a guy. Colleen, of course, has the psychotherapy background. So we sometimes say, well, um, there's when people come, sometimes if there's a need, one of us will notice it, and it might be, oh, that's a Colleen thing. She'll say, no, that's a David thing. And I'll have a quiet word with her and say, hey, Colleen, there's that woman who's from from such and such a country, and you know the one I mean? Yeah. Well, just when you get a chance, you might want to sidle up to her and ask her how things are going, because I think this is a Colleen department thing. So that's how we kind of go back and forth together. So that's
tried
my
to give you those
rambly answer.
I tried to
sorry.
give you those. It's not rambling. I tried to give you those Dutch brothers that rolled in out of the taxi, because I did not want to have anything to do with that, but
Yeah.
that ended up on my watch. So,
but artfully done, because your first intro, you settled the first words that you said, which is not the way I would have done it. You saw the shoulders go down of the older brother, and what happened thereafter was just extraordinary. So anyway,
he was so agitated. He was so agitated. He exploded into the front door, and I'm trying to welcome this lovely Korean couple with a Google Translate app, and it was, you know, and he just came in 200% of himself. He needed at least 3 times to just get him to settle down. I had to finally stand up and leave the desk, because I understood that he was agitated. And I just, I said, I see that, that you're upset. I see that you're concerned. There's a bed here for you. I'm going to help you, but I need to talk to these people. And all he needed somebody to see him and see his state, and then he settled down. But that was so many things come out of 2 weeks. Like, it is unbelievable. I would argue a little bit. David often refers to our professional backgrounds as something, and I guess we do bring that. I mean, you're kind of steeped in it. But I think what's more important is that we bring ourselves to it. We bring our unique, hopefully mostly healed selves to it. And it's also in the interaction, because we're different energies, which is not necessarily related to what we do for a living. We're just wired differently. People connect differently to us, and we don't try to be somebody else. We don't try to be each other. We just do our thing, and given enough time, people do seem to land. And at the end of some people come and stay it was a donativo we were volunteering at, and so people come in at 2:00. And they leave the next morning at 7 after dinner, breakfast, sharing circle, sunset, whole thing. People were leaving so, they would come in one way, kind of broken down by the road, and the man that flew in the door out of the taxi. And you see people over time moving through something. We're creating space, really, right? We're not, the other people are also, we would sit back and watch people healing each other by seeing each other, interacting with each other, becoming a family. Even sometimes, you know, the Italian girls, where we didn't know what they were saying, during those Italian friends, they were just so full of love and gratitude. It was beautiful. So it's, you know, we create the space and then, you know, it happens on its own a bit. But when people leave, just smiling, hugging, totally changed, total like a 180 for some people. And there was the woman who left with the backpack. Was she French? I'm not sure. And she left and she said, "Your love is so big." And she threw her hands up in the air as she was leaving, walking backwards. And I think that's an important part of it. And I don't, not to make it about us, but love is healing, right? And we love each other. I mean, I would say that's a thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I suppose.
I'm not looking for, you know, but it's, you know, you can feel it. And not comparisons, but other places where, there's people who are creating on their own this kind of container of love, Susie and Fermin, and there's other people. It doesn't have to be a couple. It can be anybody.
Joseph
You know,
Bellari.
Joseph and Bellari.
Yeah.
They're creating some kind of container of love, and they're just inviting people in. And the love is healing, you know, on its own, apart from whatever we might do. So I think that's important. And it's just, I've been trying to talk David into running off to Spain and just staying there and doing albergue work. You know, we're not quite there yet, but I would love to do that.
It could well happen. Casa O'Duncan is in
Casa
the future.
O'Duncan. It's just, as I said earlier, Heather, you know, we do therapy at home, but people are in their lives and there's so many, pressures. It's just so much, people are so much more available to themselves, even on the Camino. It's easier. It's more, people just walk into it. You know, people come in a state of readiness, I think, quite often. And I think that's where we do probably our best work, but at home, because we can't be there all the time, we try to create that kind of environment where people can come and be seen and be heard at home in our chapter. You know, I part of the hospitalero training program. So, and I do think that it's part of it's not to say it's part of the deal. Like the Camino doesn't really ask something from you. Pilgrimage doesn't, but the idea is to, when you come back, and you've been healed, whatever's happened, you come back with what you come back with, then you give it back. You know, you add to the pond. It's, I don't want to say it's part of the job, but it's part of the agreement in some ways. For me, it feels like an agreement, a spiritual agreement almost, that's why I'm doing it. I'm looking for a word. It's not compelled. It just happened naturally. You know, I'm so grateful. We're both so grateful for all we were given, and you're naturally inspired to give it to other people.
So I have to imagine that so many of your conversations together revolve around pilgrimage and being a pilgrim, and I can certainly relate to that, how this takes over one's life, not necessarily in a bad way, in a very passionate and inspired way. And Colleen, you've written a book, and both of you are working. David, you're leading the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, right? What is your official title with the CCOP? It's director.
I'm one of the directors.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm one of the directors and have some and related roles.
So I didn't want to misspeak there. You're also hospitalleros, you're pilgrims, and Colleen, you're also working with students who are doing research on aspects of the Camino. And I really want to hear about that. I actually taught a class over the summer on pilgrimage, and the students, we did some very brief phenomenological research where students were interviewing pilgrims, and then we did some thematic coding individually and then also in class. And it's magnificent work. During class yesterday, we did some group thematic analysis, and the conversation that ensued just in the dialogue around what themes are emerging across all of these interviews was fascinating. And I think your students are doing something similar, and I'd love to hear about that.
So, yeah, it was a very brief project. They had a very brief amount of time, but and they've wrapped it up, but I don't think there's a deliverable yet. But what has been wonderful is to, first of all, see that two young occupational therapy graduate students would pick up this pilgrimage project out of a list of things. They could be doing stroke research and all the usual typical things that occupational therapists are thought to do. I mean, in Canada, we do work in mental health, which might be different than in the States. But even the mental health projects, the occupational therapy mental health projects, nobody was talking about pilgrimage. And these two students were like, wow, what is that? That sounds interesting. So just even to get the interest there was fantastic, because I've been looking for other occupational therapists working in pilgrimage, and I haven't found any. So hopefully if you're listening to this podcast, please call me. So the interest was great. And then so the two students came to our Camino 101 when the project began, and just, you know, it was so new to them. Do you remember seeing them, David? They were like, "Wow, what is this community? Like, this is so intense." So they got an idea of, in a good way, yeah, in a good way. It's like wandering into, like, you know, Narnia or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they got excited, and then they went to the library and tried to do a literature review, and they were really having trouble finding kind of what they were looking for. We're looking for the intersection of occupational therapy, recovering from difficult life experiences. We took the trauma word out. You know, it's a lot of people don't relate to having trauma, but we all have had difficult life experiences that really stop us, and pilgrimage. And they were not finding a lot. And it was when I talked to you, I said, you know, are we doing something wrong? Because I'd been out of research for a while, just doing clinical work, and my research skills are a bit rusty. No, it's not a lot. So the librarian was excited. I don't know that the students were excited in that moment, because they had a whole bunch of work they had to do, connecting dots. But then when they got to they also did, it was a phenomenological qualitative study. So they were interviewing people. Oh, I want to say before that, so I'm losing my voice a little bit. The response we got from putting a note in the Canadian newsletter, we have a newsletter, then one of the editors, and, you know, I asked if it was all right if we were looking for some participants. We had over 100 people respond that they wanted to talk. And of course, we didn't have capacity because we have two students doing their graduate project. It was so small. It was 10 people. And it was a lot of work just doing that. But that was, to me, that is really hopeful that people want to talk about this. People want to go out of their way and take time to share their experience. And I think that's really great news. And then when the students were, we went through some questions that the students might ask. Of course, it was open, and, you know, to kind of give them an idea of where people might go. The themes that came out were in some things were, you know, things that I was sensing that would come out. And for the students to see this all happening was really, it was great to see their enthusiasm and surprise. And actually, one of the students read the book and saw there's a part in the book where, or in my pilgrimage, where my foot stopped working while I was trying to prepare for the Camino, almost like one of those Joseph Campbell mythic journeys, you know, the obstacle, you know, you're going to keep going. How do you get past the foot? The foot is the obstacle at the gate. And of course I had no choice. I had to go. There was no way I was not going to go. But they were hearing those kinds of stories, just this handful of pilgrims, similar themes coming out. And it's like, you know, and another thing that surprised them was completely unprompted. And for people were talking about how the walking itself, the left, right, felt like they were reprocessing. And for a couple of them that knew EMDR, the reprocessing therapy, they weren't expecting it, but they were kind of amazed that they could sort of feel it happening as it went. So we're at early stages, but it's been fantastic. And one of the other good things that's coming out of it, I think we talked about this earlier, Heather, is we assume there's a lot of people that want to do integration work. These people are absolutely, it could be self-selecting. They've contacted the study, that integration is important, but also would be helpful if the person that they're integrating with, whether it's it's a professional of whatever sort, is familiar with pilgrimage. They don't have to then go explain, what happened in the mountains, things you have no words for. You can sort of, like David and I do, we've got a shortcut, language wise for those kinds of things, and we can get right to the heart of it. And that's come out of it as well. So it's early, but it's great. So
I think pilgrims are so generous in terms of wanting to share their stories. At least that's been my experience in doing hundreds of interviews at this point. And so the phenomenological research is very well matched to pilgrims in a way that allows kind of an open exploration of the pilgrimage, but also the inner the psychological pieces around being a pilgrim and motivations and the meaning making that occurs. And so it's wonderful. I hope there will be others who hear about the work who are in occupational therapy. I know you and I had talked a bit about Michelle Courtney publishing an article a number of years ago, who was at Deakin University. And I don't know if I actually don't know what has happened with Michelle or her work. So hopefully there are others around the world actually who are seeing pilgrimage through this occupational therapy lens. It would be amazing to see that built out more.
And I do think it's from both aspects in psychological occupational therapy is a different lens, there's the work I'm doing with or the pilot project I started, which I think I will continue because it seems useful. It's an iterative process. It's in a different state that it was when I first ran it in 2024. There's a lot of capacity building. So it's, which is why I won't necessarily, I don't see myself walking with people. I do walk a little bit with people and actually have found that was useful in what I did when I didn't expect it. I'm not sure if we talked about this or not. I think we might have. As part of the learning process for the new pilgrims to see how it is to be on the road, how to interact with other people. You do eventually figure this out as you go anyway. It's a little bit of a speed course though, and the capacity building is also teaching coping mechanisms, thinking about working on values before you go and reflecting before you go. So I see a lot of the work for occupational therapy as pre and post. And I'm not sure, I'm kind of trying to work out, because people are also saying they like the idea of a lifeline in the middle, like just a touch point, whether it's a WhatsApp line or a something, not for somebody to necessarily, just reorienting them to, they're going to be okay. You've got skills, you've got tool belts and, so you've got what you need, kind of a reorienting sort of a thing. So a few people have talked about that, but occupational therapy is a different lens and it works perfectly with pilgrimage. And while I'm coming from the mental health aspect, I feel almost remiss. And there's so many people going, not walking, not able to walk, choosing not to walk, or also not able to walk. And there's a whole other way you could support pilgrimage as an occupational therapist in that way. That's not my way, but I think we could, there's room for all of it. So I was so surprised when I talked to you how little there was on occupational therapy and pilgrimage. So maybe we're at a threshold. So, or
maybe you're the person. So that maybe I when you okay, so two questions. One, you're doing this work, the pre-post work, and some of the preparation. This is through the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, or you're doing this in your practice, or both?
so both. So what we
Okay.
can offer as volunteers is definitely not a clinical kind of, this, and it's thinner, but it's useful for most people. So we offer, and maybe David can talk about this a little bit as I'm losing my voice, but we do like a basic preparation. We're basically trying to show people, you can take a tour if you want a tour, but you don't need a tour. And what's the difference? And I would also differentiate between big box tours and somebody that wants to go on a yoga pilgrimage, for instance. It's totally fine, different, but you're going to get different things from different options. And so we're preparing people en masse, like in big groups, with backpack demos and apps, showing people apps, that sort of thing. That's what we're offering through the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, and all the chapters were individual. We all do it a bit differently. But for my group, it's a much more intense, one-on-one, talking about, what are the things that you think will be difficult for you, and we work with that. For people with social anxiety, or those kinds of things. If you're worried about triggers. I never saw the mother and daughter sitting across from me on my first day coming. But, kind of preparing people as much as possible in that sort of a way. It's a more therapeutic way. But the CCOP is doing that differently. And then, of course, we also offer integration through the CCOP. But then I do that also, as you can imagine, in a clinical conversation. You're having a very different conversation than you are with even 9 people in your living room, which is still good, still very good, and not everybody needs, it's sort of self-serve, not everybody needs individual attention. So I think it's important because it makes it accessible for everybody. David?
David is thinking, do I jump in for for something long here, or do I refrain?
Well, I don't have anything to add, to be honest. I think you've expressed it really, really clearly. The only thing that crossed my mind that I wanted to add was, excuse me, when I think of the work that we do as part of the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, as very active volunteers, chapter coordinators, the biggest question that I want to ask the aspiring pilgrim is, what is the experience you think you want? Because they're all kind of stuck on socks and how. What is the gateway question I want to ask? Because the question I really, really want to ask is why. But then I've been asking that since I was like able to talk. But the what is so important because that will dictate how you choose to go. And these days, when people are looking into doing a Camino for whatever reason, what do they see initially? Well, they go online, and then they'll see 10 ads, and then they think, oh, well, maybe I'm supposed to do it in an organized way with like others because that's familiar. I've heard of tour groups. No, traditionally this is not done that way, and the vast majority of people walking on the Camino these days don't do it that way. But as Colleen said, that is a really good good option for some people, and there are a variety of other kinds of ways that are guided or semi-guided that are good for others, depending on what it is that they're hoping to experience. And 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 I think that the question isn't easy to answer for the aspiring pilgrim, that they won't necessarily know what they want. And unless you have a conversation with them to tease out things that they've heard, things that they think they want, maybe that's not what they really want. You see, that's where um, uh, uh, you know, an experienced pilgrim with a good set of ears can maybe help somebody discover, I didn't know about that way of doing it. And quick anecdote, walking up the hill to Osabrero, this happened a number of times, but going up the hill to Osabrero, somebody looks at my backpack, and if you look at my backpack, there's a whole bunch of patches on it. There's this, you asked about artifacts. I've got a thing that's an accumulation of things that I've picked up on several Caminos. It's jingly, and it's got a shell, and there's a feather, and there's little bells, and people will go, well, this is clearly not your first Camino. And I go, no, that's not it. How many times you've been on it? This is the exact conversation we're done. Well, this is my 4th time, but I've also volunteered twice. Oh yeah, what's the volunteering all about? And then one thing leads to another, and then they discover, what's a donativo? They have just walked into Galicia, and they don't even know the answer to that question. Oh, I'm so sad. They haven't seen that experience. Why? Because they're on a little tour with somebody, and they haven't been able to. They've been we've talked about boxing. They've been a little bit boxed, and it was good for them, but they kind of almost outgrown it as part of their trip. They realize that they are much more capable, self-sufficient, not as scared. They get it now. And so, some friends that we've made along the way have said, geez, I wish I wasn't being boxed into these stopping points, because I'd like to hang with you guys. I'd like to do that. So all I think about now with a number of these conversations is thinking about that what question as a volunteer, to just give them the full panoply of choices, because they might have prematurely thought it's got to be done a certain way. And I want them to have that full range of options before them, so that they make the choice that's the best for them.
Yeah, I think it's about choice, but to know that the choice is available, that's the first step. And I was thinking, when you were talking about that, about our friend Hildy from our 2022 Camino.
Oh, yeah.
And so I will say this sometimes, there's challenges and benefits to both ways. There always is, right? There's nothing is, this is the best way, it's perfect. But for people who are wanting to have some prearranged part of their Camino as part of what they're doing, the challenge isn't to find a bed, which is what the challenge might be if you're going in the traditional way. The challenge is, where am I sleeping? The challenge, if you're walking in an organized way, is, how do I meet people? How do I get into the Pilgrim River, sort of thing? Because it's oftentimes you're staying a little bit away from where people are. So it's just, that's where you have to put your effort. And Hildy ended up, see, you can do it. You can do all sorts of things. So Hildy had her rooms set out for her. She walked, I think she walked to Pamplona or further. Maybe it was just Pamplona. And we became really close with her. I want to say it was further, but she was doing it in chunks because she's a Belgian, so she can come back and forth quite easily. And we had this huge group of Pilgrim friends, because David's an 11 on a 10-point scale of extroversion. So we had like 22 people we were walking with. I was apoplectic. But Hildy kind of ended up we connected somehow, and she would walk with us, and she was part of our little family. But then she had to walk to her albergue, which was wherever it was. It was not, she wasn't part of where we were staying. But that's how she needed to begin. And then and she kept saying, I'm not a real pilgrim, which made me sad. It made me so sad. People, like you say, boxing, labeling each other, it's just awful, right? So we kept saying, that's nonsense. Of course you're a real pilgrim, and so she came back the next 2 times, and she walked in the traditional way, but that's how she needed to start. And I mean, she's still walking where she went across the Frances, and then now she did the Norte, and
it's amazing. We just love seeing her popping up on the different platforms and seeing what's next for Hildy. It's lovely.
Yeah.
She's got this huge fan club. We're sort of scattered all around England and North America, but we love to see her pop up. And
nice. So we never want to tell people there's a right way or a wrong way. We tell people this is what you get with this way. Often this is what you have to work with this way, and you have to honor yourself and what you need, and start where you can start, and that's it. And what I think is so helpful about the CCOP and the American group and all the other group where pilgrims are generously volunteering their time is it's free, it's capacity building, it's information sharing. You go to these Camino 101s, and there's no shortage of opinions. Like, you ask one question, you've got three people telling you something different, which is the information there is there's no right way. I mean, this worked for this person, this worked for that person, and they all returned, it all worked out. So, and then you can decide, do I want to do it that way, or do I want more support? Right? It's a great first step. But I don't think there's a fair amount of people that do not know this exists. So, I think in both countries. So we need marketers.
Well, do the math. I mean, I think we've got 4,200 members. If you look at Santiago.ca, the first thing you'll see is the little counter of members. Now go and take a look at the Pilgrim Office statistics of people from Canada who earned a Compostela. And that's not all the Canadians that were walking. It's bigger by a factor of, I don't know, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but it's I think at one point there's 2 or 3, maybe even 4 times as many Canadians walking as are actually members, or at least subscribers of our organization. And certain it's the same with the Americans, and probably with a lot of the other associations. So I think we all share an awareness issue. That's probably our biggest opportunity as associations, to say, hey, this network, this information, this home support in your neighborhood, it's right here for you. And also to welcome you home and to support you as you do whatever it is that you want to do, full on integration, or just needing to chat with somebody on your return. So
and an opportunity to give back, as
totally, and then
to
live it in action. Otherwise, yeah, for sure.
I think probably some people who are listening or watching are going to say, I wish I could be like them. Their lives feel integrated. They're taking, their relationship is focused on pilgrimage. Their professional lives are intersecting with pilgrimage. They're doing research with students about pilgrimage, maybe teaching courses. The clinical practice has a pilgrimage focus for those people who are interested or who are pilgrims. And the last thing I want to ask you about, it comes back to the beginning. You alluded to some other artifacts that are important to you as people. I suspect they represent or symbolize all of the pieces that I've just mentioned. And I'd like to hear the story about those artifacts as we end.
How are we going to slice and dice this one, Colleen?
How do we do this? I think the book is an artifact. That's one thing, but we talked about that. And how do we slice and dice this one, David? Yeah. So David was talking about a special day that he had, an illumination, September 9th. Was it September 9th? September 9th? Yeah. 9th day, the 9th month. And there's a story around that I'll leave it to, do you want to talk about that or not? But we went back, on September 9th of last year. And it was my first time I was leading the Let's Walk Home group. So we were kind of designing everything around these dates. So I took my small group of pilgrims and we walked for 5 days. And then we got in a car at Zabaldika, which is important to both of us, and drove to Lyon, and which is not often done on a pilgrimage. And we went to a location that is I think is a sacred place on the Camino. It's near Osobrero, and we've been sworn to secrecy. But so we were making our own kind of pilgrimage there. Do you want to talk about why September 9th is important, David, or no?
Very, very briefly, because I mean, the problem, as I'm sure you know, Heather, is you get pilgrims together and they just cannot stop talking. I mean, it's one of our friends jokes always is sort of like group therapy because our families are sick and tired of listening to us talking about it. Fortunately, Colleen and I are live together, so we get to do it all day long. Don't get sick of it. But the short story there is, there was how do I do this really succinctly? My first Camino, there had been unusual signs of that. It sounds super woo woo, but certain number kept popping up in my life in a variety of ways. And I'm a science guy, like, grew up with science people, and we're rational folks. And anyway, long story short, there was a number that just kept popping up in a variety of ways for a couple of years before I went on my first Camino. And then a very lovely spiritual friend of mine at work said to me when I told her this story, because you'd only tell this story to a few people who would get it. And she said, that number, okay. And the number was 909. And she says, well, you're going on the Camino, you're going to be in September. I wonder what's going to happen on the 9th day of September. I go, yeah, that's really, Kieran is her name. And if she ever hears this, she'll remember this. And I said, yeah, whatever. And I probably forgot about the story. But what happened was I had an injury. And it was one of those injuries from walking too quickly over the Pyrenees. And but it was such an important injury to have. And Colleen referred to some of that hero myth, art, storytelling, and sometimes the journey, and sometimes there's injuries, and they're necessary as part of the discovery. And so the good thing about having this injury is it sat me in a little town for several days to heal. And on the third day, I had been taking my breakfast early in the morning in a little square, just watching the town come back to life every morning. And there was something that I saw in that square the third morning. And when I went to write my journal, didn't know what day it was because you never do. Looked at the day before. It was the 8th of September. So today was the 9th. And then when I saw what was happening, and I realized that it was this date, and I'm thinking about Kieran's words, prescient words, and I just completely lose it. So it was a big day. I learned something very important. It's directly related to the lessons that I took away from that first Camino. So we wanted to honor our new union after we became a couple after basically through and after the pandemic, when we were all locked down. We wanted to honor that union in some special way, some sort of celebration. So we picked the 9th of September because we happened to know that there was a couple of days between Colleen's Let's Walk Home and us doing another pilgrimage. We were actually going to be volunteering, but we ended up doing another pilgrimage. So right in between, there was the 9th, and we thought, we can do this thing. So we decided to have a little celebration, and then we invited 3 friends to help us with this. And one of them said, well, it's not a wedding per se, but it's kind of like a spiritual union. And we were talking about maybe hand fasting in an old traditional way. We're both Celtic people. She's Irish, I'm Scottish, kind of thing. So long story short, somebody said, you need some rings. I don't have any rings.
But the night before.
So
I'm on the phone with somebody, and yeah. David's. We're in an albergue. It was in Canute's in Casa Catadora.
It was Canute, another person who creates a sanctuary for pilgrims. Right before it was Sobrero, introduced to him by a friend, and I'm gonna find rings. So anyway, as you do, you get very creative, and I consulted one of the other pilgrims in the house, and she had this beautiful ball of rainbow colored cotton embroidery yarn, and she said we could make some rings out of these. So I grab a hank of this, and Colleen's on the phone talking to somebody, and I grab her left hand and I start fiddling around with string. She doesn't know what I'm doing, and I'm sizing a ring for her, and I sized a ring for me. So the artifacts, to make a long story even longer, are some string rings made out of beautiful rainbow colored yarn that we used in this very, very private, intimate ceremony on the ninth day of the ninth month in a sacred place that's very dear to us with very dear friends. And this is my one, and this is Colleen's one, and these are the originals. These are the originals. Yes. We put them in a safe place for the balance of that journey, and then I made up some replicate ones because these are treasured artifacts from us becoming a couple as pilgrims and uniting our lives together on a common path after being on that Camino path separately for years before.
It was a very special morning, and we, by mistake, it depends on who you ask, how married we got. It was a very spiritual thing. It was 9:00 in the morning. It had been, the mountain had been socked in for days before.
Days after.
And we walked out of the house at 9 in the morning, and the sky was bright and blue. And, I've, when we have the pictures back, I see little blue orbs, and that's just the way I think. I feel like the ancestors were there. So that was for me, that was the full kind of integration of our journeys and into this new thing that we're doing, whatever this is.
It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing the story and for bringing the rings to show so much symbolism, and what a beautiful tribute to your relationship and your love and the community that all came together in this moment on the 9th day of the 9th month at 9 in the morning.
And again, in community, helped by pilgrims all along the way, right to the
even the rings,
the moment of that's just the way it is. They're just giving people, loving people, caring people, and it's just it fundamentally always restores my faith in humanity when in on the Camino, and that's probably the ultimate thing I could say about pilgrimage in that way, because of course there's other kinds of pilgrimage, but this particular pilgrimage is unique in its welcome of people of all faiths and none from all around the world. It's always been that way for hundreds of years.
Thank you both for taking the time to talk with me this morning about your pilgrimages, about being pilgrims, about the ways that you're giving back to other pilgrims and yet to be pilgrims through the work that you're doing clinically, Colleen, as well as with Canadian Company of Pilgrims and your book. I think that it's beautiful what both of you are doing now with your lives.
Thank you, Heather. It's very kind of you to say that.
It all feels like a privilege.